Shalom, and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a Shabbat teaching with Rabbi Adam Kligfeld.
Let me start by saying that we have Mincha and Sudash Lishit and learning every week. And it would be delightful to have more of you there. It's a nice way to end Shabbat. And every week, either one of the rabbis or the interns is teaching Torah, almost always from the following week's Parsha. And it would be just great to have an even more robust crowd, even when we're not serving samosas. And speaking of samosas, if you identify samosa with what ethnic food? Indian, right? There were samosas and Indian food all throughout Kenya and Uganda, because one of the things that we learned is that there was a significant Indian population in East Africa. Remember that both India and East Africa were British protectorates. And when we went to a fascinating museum in the town of Jinja in Uganda that spoke about the history, the unfortunately short-lived history of rail travel in East Africa, which has now been reduced to almost nothing. They're trying to rebuild it. And a significant amount of that rail travel, that rail infrastructure was built by Indians who were brought over, not very far from there, to be workforce and engineers. And so there still remains not that many ethnic Indians in Africa that we saw, but there's definitely remnants of it in the food. And I was telling someone online, right, the current mayor of New York, Zoran Mamdani, was born in Uganda. But have you looked at him? He does not look like an East African, right? He is of Indian descent, but he was born and raised in, or maybe, I don't know if he was raised there, but he was born in Uganda, and his father was born and lived in Uganda. So that's just one example of there being lots of ethnic Indians in Africa. So by show of hands, how many people here have been on at least one Temple Beth trip? This is something that you can put your hands down. How many have been on at least two? Keep your hands up if you've been on at least three. Keep your hands up if you've been on at least four. What does this Pressman count? And at least five? Okay. At least six? This began in the mid-2010s in a conversation I think I originally had with Carl Sunshine, who said we should take a synagogue trip to Cuba because the doors were open to Cuba at the time in a way that they are less now. And we organized a trip. In the end, the Sunshines, I think, could not make that trip, and Stuart Weiss was my main partner. And I think in March of 2016, 2017. We started planning it in 2016. March of 2017, we spent 8 or 9 days in Cuba. And the idea that grew from that was to bring members of this community to parts of the world that they were likely not to go to unless they were with a synagogue trip, that had a Jewish story, an understudied Jewish story, a Jewish story that had interesting things to contribute to our understanding of the Jewish condition, but was not the standard Jewish story that most people knew, and that were places that we could also contribute to by being there. Not to overstate our importance, but we were not just going for our own kind of benefit and enjoyment, but be able to have an impact on some level on the Jewish community that was there. So this started a tradition, and I list these when I announce future trips. We were in Cuba in 2017. We took 2018 off. We were in Morocco 2019. And then COVID happened. We were supposed to go to the American South in 2020, but COVID scuttled that. We finally did that trip in 2022. That's the only domestic trip that we've done, including visiting the synagogue in Jackson that was burned down about a month ago. And then we went to the Eastern Balkans, to Bulgaria, to the country of North Macedonia, and to northern Greece, to Thessaloniki, the place of the Jews called Salonika. From then, we had such a good time in the Eastern Balkans. We went to the Western Balkans, to Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Slovenia. We have been all these trips. We've worked with local travel agents rather than American tour operators. Nothing against American tour operators, but we've been able to offer these experiences, which are still a lot of actual dollars, but usually between 60 to 70 cents on the dollar in terms of what you'd pay for the same experience from American operator. By comparison, I was talking with Rabbi Camrus, who's brought his community to Africa a few times, and I was talking before the trip what his trip cost for 11 days 5 or 6 years ago to these countries was significantly more than what our trip cost for 2 weeks this year, right? And that's because he used an American operator. I said, next time you do the trip, talk to me because I can save your car against dollars, right? So travel is expensive, but this makes it relatively less expensive. After the Western Balkans last year with our scholar and friend, Dr. Rabbi Michael Berenbaum, we went to Poland and to the Czech Republic and to Slovakia and to Hungary. And then we decided to do something very different this past year. I had been sort of thinking about this trip for some time. I knew nothing about East African Jews aside from the Ethiopian experience until I got to LA. It just wasn't on the radar. Right? I remember Operation Moses in 1984, and I remember Operation Solomon in 1991. But that's the extent of East African Jewry that I was aware about. It was before I met Larry and learning about the Jewish community in Maputo and Mozambique. But in Los Angeles, because Rabbi Gershom Sizomu, who is of and from the Abba Yudai Jewish community in Uganda and came to train at Ziegler and studied with Michael's daughter, Rabbi Lana Greenblatt, when he was here, this community is aware of, on some level, the idea that there are Jews in East Africa whose story is very, very different than the Ethiopian, right? The Ethiopian Jewish community traces themselves back perhaps to the 10 tribes, right? They've been there thousands of years, and they were disconnected from a lot of the centuries of Jewish life. The East African Jewish story south of Ethiopia is very different. It began in the 1910s when a charismatic leader of a community near Mbale, who had been sort of leading a quasi-messianic Jewish existence, decided that the New Testament had actually perverted the Old Testament rather than supplanted it, and he wanted to go back to the roots, and he studied the Old Testament, and he studied modern Judaism on some level, and decided, I want to be a Jew, and he converted himself and many of his fellow Klansmen. That came out wrong. I meant people of his clan, not Klansmen. Yeah. But still after that lived with relative obscurity vis-a-vis the knowledge of American Jews. That was suppressed, obviously, during the reign of Idi Amin. And then once Idi Amin was deposed, it became freer and safer again for the Jews to be Jews. And that community grew. And at some point there was a wedding, not a formal wedding, but like a nexus between that community and parts of the American Jewish community. And Rabbi Brad Artson, Rabbi Cheryl Peretz, and others went to Uganda something like 15, 20 years ago. At some point, Rabbi Cameras, can we just keep it down a little bit? It's a little bit hard to talk. And did a mass conversion by halacha so that they really can be considered Jews by our standards, right? As far as we can tell, there are about 2,000 Jews in Uganda. And then about 25 years ago, a similar phenomenon happened. There were a group of Kenyans who were living in the middle of nowhere in the highlands of Kenya, who also kind of decided for themselves, hey, maybe we should go to the source and stop relying on the New Testament as the interpretation of the Old Testament and actually live Old Testament Judaism. And they learned about Judaism on their own, and they learned about the Ugandan Jewish community. They basically asked the Ugandan Jewish community to be their patrons and their sponsors. And now there is a small but growing community of indigenous Kenyan Jews who are living Judaism like we are. And I'll get to the details in a second. I had heard about some of these stories. I knew Rabbi Gershom's name. I'd met him a few times. I was Facebook friends with some of the Kenyan Jews. I knew nothing about their lives. And then I was talking to one of our tour operators a couple of years ago who works for Liberty Travel, which is a worldwide travel group, who had been brought to Kenya on one of these junkets where professionals are brought to show what you can offer your clients. And I was seeing some of the pictures and the videos and the wildlife and meeting the members of the Maasai tribe. And I thought, wow, this could be an interesting mashup, right? Bring Jews from LA, very far away, spend Shabbat with the Jews of Kenya, Shabbat with the Jews of Africa, see some wildlife in between, and see what impact we could leave. This was the first time that we formally built into the trip an obligation to fundraise. Last year, we did some informal fundraising and leaving tzedakah in different places that we were visiting Eastern Europe. But in order to participate in this trip, in addition to paying for it, you had to agree to raise, I think, $1,800. I didn't hold people to the actual dollar amount. I didn't turn people away, from the trip on the day of if they hadn't gotten to that level. But the idea was turn to friends and family and share with them a little bit about the incredibly resource-starved Jewish communities in East Africa, and see if you can raise some money on their behalf. And I'm proud to say that through the efforts of the people who have who came on the trip, plus some that I contributed, we will have basically given them close to $50,000, which to us is not that much money. It's not nothing, but it's not that much money to this institution. To them, it's unbelievable. And I want to explain to you why it's unbelievable. This trip was very, very different than all the other ones that we did. It was really hard. And you're going to say, cry me a river. You're on, a trip to an exotic place for 2 weeks. It was very hard to take white American Jews used to certain creature comforts when it comes to washing oneself, using the facilities, air conditioning, and bring them to the equator on extremely bumpy roads. They don't have coach buses the way you think about it when you travel in America or Europe. We were on Jeeps, right? Divided 6 people to a Jeep, 7 people to a Jeep, and with barely working air conditioning. Most days the temperature in the low to mid 90s, and hotels they were fine. They weren't like patently unpleasant, but not the level of hotels that most of us are used to, even going to a simple Courtyard by Marriott. It was a hard trip. These were long days, they were hot days, and they were it was hard to kind of be on those Jeeps for that amount of time. It also changed some of the group dynamic, because on previous trips, we spent a lot of time on the bus processing, talking, sharing, singing. And we weren't all together on this trip. In fact, we kept talking about we need an opportunity to process, but it was very rare that we were all in the same place, right? So the trip was a different kind of challenge than we were used to. And it was also a trip and I'll let some of the people who were on the trip share some of their own experiences, moving and inspiring on a different level as well. First of all, one of the things that was moving and inspiring was the wildlife, right? The wildlife is awe-inspiring. I don't think I expected East Africa to be so green and so lush. I don't know why. I should have thought of it that way. It's sub-Saharan, right? So there's no reason I shouldn't have imagined it. But it was incredibly green, and Uganda more than Kenya. We did several different safari rides through preserves, and you can think of that as purely being a tourist. Or you can think about it through the prism of being a religious Jew who is alert to blessing moments, right? There's a blessing that you say when you see a wonder of nature. Oseh Maseh Breshit, blessing God, who is the one who does creation, right? I mean, the obligation to say 100 blessings a day, that was easy on this trip, because every place we looked to see a species you've never seen before, and even heard of, topi and Thompson's gazelles, and then the wonder of seeing some of the 5 big animals that people hope to see on safari: rhinoceros, elephant, hippopotamus, a Cape buffalo, and we never saw a leopard, but we kept looking for it. But we did see a cheetah. We saw a cheetah sunning himself and stretching. And obviously ostriches and giraffes. Like, apparently I'm giving this presentation in group format. It's a group effort. So those religious experiences. Some of us participated in an optional add-on of doing a hot air balloon ride over the Masai Mara Nature Preserve, We got up well before sunrise. We watched them fill up the balloon. It's a very weird process. You get into the balloon horizontal because the basket is on its back, and then as the balloon fills up with air, all of a sudden you're vertical. It's very strange. You're not belted in. There's no harness. I'm trying to imagine like an American version of this. This would not fly. You're just in the balloon. I was wondering if it was going to be scary with the wind rushing by and we're going to feel like you were so exposed, but you actually experienced the wind not at all. Anyone ever been here? Everyone here been in a hot air balloon, right? You don't experience the wind because you're with the wind. There's no engine in this hot air balloon, so the wind is carrying you. So the sound in the hot air balloon is, and you're just gliding across the savannah. And to glide over elephants and giraffes and gazelles was at sunrise, saying Modeh Ani. So being there as tourists and as Jews at the same time was pretty remarkable. As many of you know, I'm an Avelut for my mother. My sister happened to be on this trip. This was planned a long time ago. And in fact, at some point last summer, we were trying to convince my mother to come on this trip because she seemed to be well enough to do so. As you know, normally when I travel, I gather us at least once, I try twice a day for some kind of a minyan experience. We should be Jews where we are. So to daven in these beautiful natural expanses and also be able to hold my sister's hand as we said Kaddish for my mother was very, very special. The most wonderful wildlife moment we did a hike in Uganda around an area called Seppi Falls, and we enter into a national park and we meet our kind of rangers for the day. And before we go on a trail, we see two baboons playing with each other, like tumbling and rustling. And we've been told, stay away from the wildlife, right? And all of a sudden, they come up to us. We're like, ah! And the ranger said, no, they're okay, because they are sort of being half convalesced at the barracks of the rangers who live there. And we started a 7-mile walk. And they walked with us the entire time. And they jumped into our arms and they cuddled with us and they nuzzled. It was like holding a toddler. In particular, Dan Lowe became an adoptive father to one of these baboons. And it was just remarkable to be that close to primates, almost if you're looking back into the evolutionary tree, just 1 or 2 steps. And they escorted us all 7 miles, and that was a real highlight. So the wildlife was inspiring. But the Jewish communities, oh my goodness. I don't know what I expected, but I didn't expect this. To get to where the Kenyan Jews live, I can't tell you how many miles of dirt road we got to before we got to the dirt road that takes you to the dirt path, that takes you to the dirt something, that takes you to a place that on the map says this is where the Jews are. You're like, it can't possibly be. And then you open up a gate, and you see a little white building with a Magen David, I forgot the actual name of the community, and a menorah. And you walk inside, and it's I don't know, think of like a small Beit Am at a Camp Ramah in the 1960s where a particular Eidah davens. It's very, very simple with plaster cracking and Sim Shalom Sidurim that have been donated over the years, and not like Proto-Judaism, not Erzatz Judaism, they're trying, but it's not really Judaism. If you close your eyes and you listen to the tefillot that they do, they have some of their own tunes, but they also have some of our tunes, you'd think you were in Toledo, right? Or in Miami, but you are in Kenya. And this is a small community, a couple of hundred people total. The people who are active are in the tens. They do a full kriya. They read the entire Torah reading, right? We helped a little bit, but had we not been there, they would have done it. Most of the people leading that service are brothers of and father to Samson in Deritu, who is married to Daphna Sizomu, who is the daughter of Rabbi Gershon Uganda, right? So Rabbi Gershon's daughter, Daphna, married Samson from the Kenyan Jewish community, and his father, whom they call the rabbi, but he's not an ordained rabbi, he's just been trained a little bit by Gershon, and his brothers run the community. People kept walking into the shul who looked like Samson because they have a very, very strong family resemblance. He has like 5 or 6 brothers who help run that service. We spent Shabbat there. Some people stayed in a hotel nearby. Some of us actually stayed, I don't even know how to describe what it was. It was sort of a house, but it was, it was like, think of like a house where 1/3 of the infrastructure of the house is built, but the rest is not really running water, not really electricity. But for those of us who were Shomer Shabbat, we couldn't go back and forth to the hotel, and we slept there. It was also the room in which people gathered. It was also the room in which we had meals. So they did all of the cooking for us. We had, for those who eat meat, there was fleishiks because they've trained a shochet there. One of Jeff's brothers is a shochet, so there was fresh meat, probably had been squawking a few hours earlier, maybe even bleating a few hours earlier. I don't know if it was anything more than foul. And Rabbi Alana Grimblad and I each gave Divrei Torah, and we talked with them. And obviously, their lives are exceedingly different than ours, and they look very, very different than us. And some of their tunes are very different than ours, but they are Jews, and they think of themselves as Jews. And many of them have actually been converted to Judaism. I met some people who are still on the pathway of kind of moving over from Messianic Judaism to Judaism, and it's so funny that it's funny and wonderful that the version of Judaism that they're converting to is our version of Judaism, right? This is, Chabads around the world, to their credit, are opening their doors and exposing travelers and seekers to that brand of Judaism. But for some reason, Masorti Judaism is the Judaism that's flourishing in East Africa, and that was pretty remarkable. We ended up going from Kenya to Uganda. We landed in Entebbe, which was interesting in and of itself, to be on that tarmac, nearly 50 years since the raid on Entebbe, which was, I think, July 4th, if I'm not mistaken, July 4th, 1776. What did I say? Yeah. We spent a couple of days in Uganda before we got to Mbale, where the Abba Yudaya community is. When we drove into the Abba Yudaya community in Mbale, it made, this looked like a palace and a compound compared to what we saw in Kenya. There's a nice big synagogue. When I say big, it's not a Beth Am, it's not a Sinai, but it's a big structure. There's no air conditioning, and it's very Spartan, but it's also very, very beautiful. And there are lots of buildings on this hill. This is the hill where, I forgot his name, I can't believe I forgot the name of the founder, right? Established the community. And there's also a guest house that they built with previous rounds of fundraising, which is where some of us stayed. It's interesting, we drove up and we were surrounded by beautiful children who were coming over to us, and they were singing Shalom and Shabbat Shalom. And we spent about 45 minutes with us saying, oh my God, these are the young Jews of this community, until the community actually arrived. These are just locals who know that this location is a place that sometimes tourists come to, bringing sweets and bringing money and bringing food, and they've learned the language. They know how to charm you with a Shabbat Shalom, and some of them actually have now become somewhat economically reliant on Rabbi Gershom. They're not Jews, but even though the standard of living on that hill is not a standard of living I think any one of you would want to live for more than a week, it's still much, much better than the standard of living just a couple of 100 meters away. And so they draw from people in the area who come and they feel embraced and they feel accepted and they're fed. And some of the converts that Rabbi Gershom has gotten has been through that process, right? They come in through the need of the body and they get fed for the needs of the soul. Again, on that Shabbat, both Rabbi Alana and I gave Divrei Torah. We read Torah. We helped with the davening. But they didn't need much help with the davening. The davening was incredible. They had two or three drummers in the front. They didn't use instruments per se, but they had drummers, and just a simple beat the entire time. Some of our tunes, some of their tunes, their tune to L'Chadodi is much less intricate than some of the L'Chadodi tunes that we use, but beautiful in its own right. And you had a sanctuary rather filled with African men and women who, I'll just say it, they know how to close their eyes and pray better than we do, better than all of you and better than me. They're willing to experience a sense of abandon. They're not overly self-conscious of having to stay in a certain formal structure. They're not embarrassed to be spiritual, right? Culture is a big deal, right? So there's a certain natural, local African culture that you've experienced if you've ever been to an African church, right? That's different than most white churches. Culture is significant. And have that overlaid onto egalitarian Masorti Judaism was fascinating, right? The people who led davening were both men and women, and the spirit was palpable and infectious and inspiring. We had dinner in Rabbi Gershom's house, which is down below. It looks like a really significant home. It's protected by barbed wire because there are concerns, not necessarily anti-Semitic concerns, but more concerns of burglary related to the fact that he looks like he has more money than people around him. I'll get back to that in a second. But also Rabbi Gershom ran for and served in the Ugandan parliament for 5 years, from 2017 to 2021, something like that. And it was only when he was serving in parliament that he got a government salary, and he used most of that government salary to build his home. And the reason why he needed to use the government salary to build his home is because the size of his salary of serving as the rabbi of the Abba Yudaya community and being the chief rabbi of Uganda is zero. He has no salary because they don't have any money. They have nothing. These are lower than subsistence farmers, if anything. So the only way that Rabbi Gershom feeds his family, and he feeds hundreds of people every Shabbat, is from donations that come in from American Jews. Rabbi Kamras at Hamakom runs the Friends of the Abba Yudaya community. That's the organization through which we made our donation. And I made it very clear when I made my donation that I wanted some of that money to go to Rabbi Gershom as salary, not just for him to support the infrastructure of his work, but he, in Kemach ein Torah, if he has no money, no food, he's not going to be able to continue to do his work. And then on Saturday night, as we were doing Havdalah outdoors under the stars, he turned to me and he said, "What's your plans for tomorrow?" I said, "I think we're leaving at 7 in the morning because we have a long, bumpy, dusty ride back to Kampala, where we're spending the last day before our flight from Entebbe." He said, "Well, do you think you can help us out with some conversions?" And I said, that would have been a very nice question to ask me 6 months ago when I'm planning the itinerary. But luckily, because we were in different jeeps and we didn't have to all leave at the same time, we were able to arrange it. Why? He works with potential converts all the time. He doesn't often have a Beit Din in Uganda. And he had himself, and he had me, and he had Rabbi Ilana Grinblatt. So, and you need a Beit Din to do a conversion. What else do you need to do a conversion of half the population? Well, you need a mikveh. They have a river, and you need a moil. Now, I think I told you before that my sister, Dr. Jennifer Novik, was on the trip with us. My sister's profession is she's a mohelet. That's what she does for a living. She was trained as a pediatrician. She gave up private practice a long time ago, and now her work is to be a mohelet throughout New England. So she was there too. If she hadn't been there, Rav Gershom is also trained. And there were 21 candidates for conversion that had simply been waiting for the opportunity to complete it. Why he didn't tell me this in advance, I don't know. I guess, the way African logistics are different than Los Angeles logistics. So we sent the other jeeps ahead the next morning to Kampala, and one jeep full went back to the hill to do the conversions. And we were in the back room of the sanctuary, and Ilana and Gershom and I did a Beit Din through a translator. Some of these stories, there were two women who were co-wives of the same man, because plural marriage does still happen in that community. They were both married to a Jewish man, and between them they had about 7 or 8 children, and they had been coming to synagogue. These were not fakers. They knew what they were doing, why they were doing it. They know some of the prayers better than some of you know the prayers, but they weren't Jewish yet. And we interviewed them and asked them what their motivations were. And they seemed very sincere, not that we were going to reject them, but they actually seemed sincere. We met with a young boy who was 14 years old, whose mother had kind of a history of coming to a community marrying a man, having a child, leaving the child, and going on to the next community. And 14 years ago, she had left a child with this community and said, please raise him Jewish. So he's basically like been raised by the community, no parents, because the father's gone. They have no idea who the father is. The mother left when he was an infant. He'd been raised by the community. Why he had never been converted in a previous trip of rabbis, I don't know. And he talked about the fact that this community was his home and his family, and Judaism was his home, and it was time to convert. So we finished all the Batei Din, and then, this was not the drive up to the AJU Mikvah al Mulholland. We drove about 15 minutes, parked the Jeeps, and then walked about a mile and a half down to a river in blazing hot sun. It was, to me, a biblical scene. I felt like Cecil B. DeMille should have been filming it. The women went first, so Rabbi Gershom and I obviously stood on a hill away without looking at them. But I'm not saying that we didn't have to do that. I'm saying that the women were not private because this was a semi-public place. So in that culture, it's just not that abnormal for people to bathe partially or completely in the nude. So when we finally turned around after we had been told that they were out of the water, we could see that there were spectators watching this entire thing. But we heard the whooping and we had these women holding their babies in a moving river. All right, babies are slippery when they're naked. I got a little bit nervous, but they all dunked. My sister was the one who was sister and Alana were the ones who were running that part of the show. They dunked 3 times, and then they got dressed, and then we turned to the boys. I think the boys who were under the age of bar mitzvah dunked with their mothers, and the one who was 14 years old, we dunked him another part of the river. And then we sang, and we danced, and then we walked a mile and a half back up the hill to a dusty parking lot where we said goodbye and made our way to Kampala. We converted 21 Jews that day, which means we added 1% to the national Jewish population because there were about 2,000 Jews in Uganda. So in some ways, this was the trip that had the least amount of days on the trip that had Jewish content. Most of the times when I do trips, every day there's something related to Jewish history, Jewish present, Jewish culture, Jewish whatever. Here, it was concentrated on the Shabbatot for the most part, but boy, were they packed with experiences and opportunities to learn about how Jewish life is thriving in the most inhospitable and unexpected of places. We went to two other Jewish sites on the trips. One of them was not attended by everybody. In Nairobi, on the first day that we got there, the day that we woke up, we went to visit the Orthodox Jewish community of Nairobi. This is primarily a white Anglo community. Remember, this was a British protectorate, I said before, and from the 1920s, there were British Jews who were coming to Nairobi to do business, and sometimes they stayed for quite a long time, and they established a synagogue. You drive in, everyone's seen the show The Crown, the episode where young Queen to be Elizabeth is on some mission to Africa, and that's where she learns that her father died. And it's just this lush compound, and people waving these big fronds to cool them down, and servants, and it like a certain pre-modern or pre-20th century elegance. That's what this compound looks like. You feel like you are in Africa, in some kind of subtropical campus. And then you walk into the synagogue and you could be in Teaneck. It's so amazing. It looks like a shul, like much more than the ones in the indigenous communities in Kenya and Uganda. It's an Orthodox synagogue, so it's divided men and women. The rabbi who is there is an Israeli guy who just got here about 6 months ago, so apparently it's one of these rotations where a shaliach gets sent, like the synagogue in Tokyo, spends 3-5 years with the family, and then, probably not going to spend a career there. They have davening every weekend. I think they even have some daily minyanim. He told us about what he knew about the community, the history of it. There are plaques there from different times that the community was established. There's a mikveh there. It's very well guarded. All of the protection in infrastructure and staffing of this synagogue is provided by the Kenyan government. Wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to pay for our own security staff here, right? Very lovely young Orthodox rabbi. I said to him we wanted to daven, and he said, we don't have a minyan. I said, well, we think we do have a minyan, but I'm very respectful of minhag hamakom. Right? When I'm a visitor in someone else's shul. So I said to him, it's like we could just daven as individuals, yichidim. He says, no need for that. And he walked out. And he let us daven as a mixed community in an Orthodox synagogue, and he did not have to do that. And I was very touched by that hospitality because it's probably well beyond what he considers to be a normative Jewish practice. So that was one Jewish site we visited in addition to visiting the Jewish communities. Some of us whose flights were later out of Kampala the last day, we visited the Chabad of Kampala. We didn't know it was a Chabad because on the map it said Jewish Community of Kampala. There once actually was a Jewish community of Kampala made of some Abba Yudaya Jews, but they mostly left the city. Kampala is a big city, and they're out in the countryside. And that community's name has been kind of taken by the Chabad rabbi. We went and visited. It's also a very well-protected compound. I mean, again, it's not my way of doing Jewish. It's not my theology, but God bless this Israeli rabbi who is living in Kampala and raising his children there. He's got 5 or 6 children running around the house. He doesn't always have a minyan on Shabbat, because it's not a place that a lot of Jews visit, but the Rebbe sent him here. I mean, that's how he understands it, and he's going to be there forever, providing an opportunity for Jewish travelers and sometimes Jewish businessmen who are there for a period of time to have a Jewish address while they're there. So I'll pause in a second to see if I have any questions. Let me see if I have other notes. Oh, a few more notes, and then I'll pause. It was a remarkable experience. It's always an honor to travel with members of this community. We were able to involve members of other communities as well. And I do think that we had an impact, right? Do we change them forever? No. But they have one more connection now to American Jews and to a funding source and to a community that knows about them and cares about them and is invested in their thriving. And what they're doing against all odds is pretty remarkable. I also want to share, we had a visit to a Maasai village in the Maasai Mara, near the Maasai Mara Game Reserve. And this is, the Maasai are one of the tribes of Kenya who are essentially living like prehistoric times, right? They're not quite those populations like in Papua New Guinea who've never been met by the modern world. They've met the modern world, right? But they're living in huts that they make for themselves out of dung, and their homes have no infrastructure whatsoever, and they draw water from the well, or from the river, which is like 1.5 miles away. And they spoke to us, and they sang for us, and they danced for us and with us. And I remember thinking as I was walking away, should my Western human reaction to what I saw and whom I met be pity that the modern technological world has not gathered them up, and they're living in squalor and living in dirt, and they're not getting to taste modernity the way we do? Or they didn't seem so unhappy. They knew where we were staying at the lodge nearby. They did not seem to evince any envy for our lives. And I was thinking about the conversations they have with each other that are not interrupted by the headlines and are not interrupted by their devices. And I'm not romanticizing what it's like to live in that village. But there's something about a pre-modern way of organizing family and communal life that is lost in the modern world, and the contrast I found to be very interesting. The last thing I want to say is that the plans for the next trip, whose dates are not yet secure, are underway, and I think I've shared this, that we're going to be going to Uzbekistan and Azerbaijan, other places that I imagine people in this community are unlikely to visit were it not for a synagogue community. Why there? My parents went to Uzbekistan about 25 years ago. For a while, they would travel with an Israeli scholar named Yov Tov Assis, who said that he built his house on his moshav with his academic salary, but he built his kids' houses by taking American Jews to Sephardi Jewish sites because he was a scholar of Sephardi Judaism. So my parents went to Spain, Portugal, Turkey, Italy, Morocco, and also to Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan has the city of Bukhara, as in Bukharan Jews, and the capital Tashkent, and a small community in a town called Urgench and in Samarkand. And Azerbaijan, which is a country on the Caspian Sea, a former Soviet republic, is a country that some of my colleagues recently visited on a rabbinic mission there. The local consul general of Azerbaijan was supposed to speak at Beth Am in December. They're doing lots of outreach to Jewish communities because Azerbaijan is a predominantly Muslim country that has a very, very warm relationship with its small and proud Jewish community, as does Uzbekistan. And both of them have diplomatic relations with Israel, which is uncommon in the Muslim world. It's becoming more common, but it's uncommon. So we thought it'd be interesting to bring us, American Jews, to a Muslim country to experience their hospitality, their culture, their cuisine, and to visit the Jewish community there. One more word about the Jewish community. I figured we'd spend Shabbat in Baku, because Baku is apparently a gleaming, beautiful city on the Caspian Sea. There are kosher restaurants there. There's a Jewish day school, not LA size, but it exists. And then our travel agent for this trip, who was born in Bulgaria but lives in Germany and does most of her tour guiding or travel arrangement in Africa, she started to do some research for us. And when she presented me with the first version of the itinerary, she suggested we visit a place called Krasnaya Sloboda. That's the Russian name of this place. There's probably also a local Azeri name. And Krasnaya Sloboda in Azerbaijan has the distinction of being one of the only cities or towns in the world outside of Israel where every resident is Jewish. There are 4,000 to 5,000 people living in Krasnaya Sloboda up in the mountains of Azerbaijan, and for centuries, almost like it's a Shalom Aleichem story, it's only been Jews living there. So we're going to visit there. I still think we're going to spend Shabbat in Baku because there's more infrastructure there, but I'm excited to go to places that I had never even imagined existed, and I'm thrilled to be in a relationship with a non-Jewish Bulgarian-German travel agent who understands our needs and curiosities and wants to plan trips that are going to satisfy us. And when that date is set, I'm sure we'll publicize it, and hopefully that trip will fill up. So that's what I wanted to share, and I'm happy to field some questions and or let some people who are on the trip share their impressions as well. Norm.
I just wanted to add that I read just yesterday that the Kenyan community that you visited celebrated they've been officially recognized by the Kenyan government as a religion and religious organization.
Oh, wow. I did not know that. That's great. Terrific. Dr. Michael Berenbaum. Okay, so within the communities, very much. They have Israeli flags all over their little compounds. They consider themselves to be very Zionist. Some of them have visited Israel. How they get the resources to even get out of their village, I don't know. But some of the young people, the 20-something-year-olds, both in Kenya and in Uganda, have been to Israel. We didn't hear Israel mentioned really at all in the other parts of the trip, neither good nor bad, right? We didn't really get a sense of Kenya and Uganda's relationship to Israel, but those communities, they feel very, very connected in an old-fashioned way to Zion, it was very weird and wonderful to daven north, by the way, but to the North Star of their religious life, they feel very, very connected. Yeah. Rosa? We had a long drive from Mbale to Kampala, and they just started the drive earlier.
No, excuse me. We stopped at another one of the Abadayan. Correct, right?
No. You're close, though. Try again.
Abayudaya.
There you No. Abayudaya.
Abayudaya. Okay. I've been messing that word up the whole trip.
She was calling them the Yabba Dabba Doos.
One of the people
one of the people that was with us who is from Los Angeles but now in Israel studying, has been in contact with this other group on the way, our trip from Mbale to Kampala. We stopped there 2 bus loads, 2 Jeep loads, 14 people plus our guide. And we had a wonderful, about half hour. I will be talking to the library minion, and if it could be possible, I could talk, if we could mix the upstairs and downstairs in 2 weeks. My aspect of the trip is different than Rabbi's. His is great. Mine is great.
Thank you, Barbara.
You're very, very welcome.
So kind. So
No,
complimentary.
I'm doing it as kind of a travelogue, but I'm throwing in a lot of stuff that happened that we learned along the way, that I thought was really important. And so we stopped there. That day, they actually had a ton of teenager kids. We had a lot. They had a lot of teenager children. And I said, why are there so many children here? This is amazing. And we were told they were having a B'nai B'rith youth organization weekend of the Jewish children at that synagogue that weekend. B'nai B'rith from here was apparently doing something over there. I don't know all the details. I mean, we had a short trip because we were on this long trip to Kampala.
It's their youth movement. That's, yeah. Let's do one
No,
voice
these
at a
were
time. So
black
Barbara, finish
kids.
up, then
Yeah.
Paul has a question.
These were black kids, but the one comment I would like to add before you come to synagogue in 2 weeks and listen to me is that these people that we met, these black Jews, when we met them, we felt like we were family to them. They were so friendly. They wanted us to be there. They wanted to talk to us. And the children came to me because of my I wasn't Johnny Appleseed, I was Barbara Pumpkinseed. And I gave out to 40 or 50 kids handfuls of pumpkin seeds that I had carried over. They loved it. But they loved us. They were so happy that we were there.
Thank you, Barbara. Paula, we'll do 1 or 2 more, and then it's time to end Shabbat. Paula?
I was wondering about how egalitarian it was, especially in Kenya and in the Kenyan community. And then I was wondering about like the intersection of politics in the Jewish community there. In Uganda, you can't be gay. You can't be outwardly gay. It's punishable by death. And so how is it within the Jewish Ugandan community? How are they dealing with the anti-LGBTQ laws, and how egalitarian is egalitarian?
Yeah, so Kenya and Uganda are very traditional societies. And so the approach to gender is different there than it is in Los Angeles. Ritually speaking, it was completely egalitarian. Right? When we got to the Kenyan little hut, it seemed that most of the women were sitting on one side of the aisle and most of the men were sitting on the other side of the aisle. But it was lav dafka, because it was not everyone, and when I accidentally sat where most of them were sitting, it was clearly not an issue. And some of the services were led by women of their community. Same in Uganda, right? When Rabbi Gershom trains his students and acolytes, he trains the men and women exactly the same. So there are certain elements of the society that are more gender divided than in our society, but the Bima is completely egalitarian. In terms of the Ugandan government's laws about relationship to the LGBTQ community, it didn't really come up. It's by far, I think, not their number one or number 101 or 1001 concern. There was one point when we were gathering under a tree for a conversation Shabbat afternoon between me and Rabbi Gershon, that one of the members of the local community asked a question like that, asked whether Rabbi Gershon would be accepting of LGBTQ, I forgot exactly how he said it, people, and Rabbi Gershom very wisely and very carefully said, I will not answer that question, because the question was asked by someone from outside who sometimes infiltrates the community, who's trying to goad Rabbi Gershom into saying something that could get him into trouble. And if you get into trouble in Uganda, you're really in trouble. So Rabbi Gershom shut him down, and we moved on. So they clearly live with the recognition, with the awareness that the government's approach to this is very serious, and if you get in the way of the Ugandan government, you're in trouble. He was in the Ugandan government at some point, but I don't know to what extent it's at all a practical issue for them. It's just not it's not their primary or secondary or tertiary concerns as they're building their community, but they're very much aware that that's the milieu in which they live. Yeah. Leonard, last question, then we'll do Birkat Hamazon. Yeah.
And I read that they closed shut down the internet because they didn't want demonstrations and violence that might happen to people who are able to communicate with each other. And I just wondered if you saw any aspects of that.
So Leonard's asking, I'll repeat for the people on Zoom, that elections took place in Uganda, both national and regional ones before we got there, and he'd heard that the internet had been shut down. Absolutely right. We were actually a bit nervous about it before going. The national elections were a sham, right? The same guy has been in power for 40 years. Somehow he always wins 82% of the vote. It's amazing. And a lot of our time spent in Uganda were spent in traffic jams as these, I don't know how to describe them, these like parades of trucks with like, people falling out of the side and waving banners and blaring music, usually for a local city councilman election. We were still in the aftermath of that. But before we got there, they had no internet. The last few days of trying to be in contact with our contacts in Uganda were very hard because they couldn't get our messages even on WhatsApp. When we got there, those of us who had ordered an eSIM or were going to use an international plan, we had no coverage the entire week we were in Uganda, because while at some point the government turned back on the internet and turned back on the cell lines, what was explained to us is that no new accounts were permitted because they were trying to stop the idea of people going around the system by starting a new account. So when you come to a country and get a new number because you're a tourist, you're essentially creating a new account. So we all paid for it, not that much money, and we had no service the entire time. Most of the hotels had somewhat good Wi-Fi, but a week before they had no Wi-Fi. So we got there just in time to be able to at least be in contact once we got to our hotels at night. So we did feel the burden and the onerousness of living in a truly autocratic society, in a society with truly no freedoms, where you're very much at the mercy of the government's whim. And we mostly were unscathed by it, but you felt it in a heavy way. Yeah. Okay, so we'll do Birkat Hamazon, and then we'll do Mariv, and thank you for listening, and hopefully you'll be with us in Krasnaya Sloboda whenever that trip happens.
You've been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast website or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information on Temple Beth Am, Los Angeles, please visit www.tbala.org.